Hello. Welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 105. That's exciting. I thought for a second that I'd have some sort of exciting thing to think of when I got to 100, but it's all the same, just more philosophy. Let's read some philosophy. Awesome. Alright, so I've just been looking at the popular journal list because that way I get to. So many journals, there's a lot that just publish a lot, and I fear it's swamping my what I'm looking at. So you know what? I think Dialectica is a good journal. Let's take a look at what Dialectica has to say. See what's forthcoming. Oh, actually. Okay, nothing really there, so let's go back to 2019. Ooh, wait. Color and the problem of perceptual presence. Alright, so then we'll check that one out. See how long it is, really. Download from archive, because it's already there. 24 pages, not happening. But it was worth the shot. Okay, review. How close are possible? A critique of Brogaard and Salerno's account of Counterpossibles. 15, alright, so that's 14 pages, that's possible. 15 pages, how not to do that. Special composition question. 14 pages. Review. Okay, so let's see if we can grab one of these. This one or fundamentalism, and this one. All right, so let's see what we got. Teleological answer. It's not here. Let's see if this one's here. Nope. And what about this one? This one is here, so that makes it easy. Cool beans. And here we're gonna go. Here we go. We've got this. Sorry, starting a few minutes late today. I was chatting with my brother who's in California. If you join me live, as I hope you do one time, you can, and you're not here when I post the link, you can get it by typing !paper in the chat, and this link will pop back up. So that's cool. So hopefully this is not 4 billion pages. It is as it says it is. Oh, it's a LibreOffice file. Okay, that's fine. Okay, 21, but double spaced. That's very reasonable. And we are good to go. Awesome. So, here we are. Introduction. Impossible world semantics for counterpossibles. Counterpossibles are counterfactuals with metaphysically impossible antecedents. So, what is... Alright, I should know... I can't tell you the definition of metaphysically impossible antecedent, but I'm sure they'll tell us. So, following the literature, subjunctives and stuff. It is well known that Lewis-Stallnacher semantics of conditionals have issues with counterpossibles. Roughly speaking, according to Lewis-Stallnacher semantics, if it were the case that P, it would be the case that Q. So, if P then Q is true if and only if the nearest P worlds are also Q worlds. But what happens when there are no possible P worlds? According to Lewis's favorite account, counterpossibles are vacuously true, meaning that regardless of the content of the specific conditional, they will always come out true. I will call this positive vacuism. To many, this seems like a counterintuitive result of Lewis-Stallnacher semantics. I mean, I'm not entirely sure where people get their intuitions from about this stuff, but that's fair enough. That's what people say. Here are 2 examples of counterpossibles that strike some authors as counterexamples to vacuism. If Hobbes had squared the circle, sick children in the mountains of South America at the time would not have cared. If intuitionist logic were the correct logic, then the law of excluded middle would still be unrestrictedly valid. The first sentence seems intuitively true, but not trivially so. If change the consequent to mathematicians at the time would not have cared, and the counterfactual becomes intuitively false. The second sentence seems false, again, non-vacuously. Replace the consequent with its negation, and intuitively you get a true sentence. Perhaps most of us couldn't care less what the imaginary world in which Hobbes had squared the circle would have been like, but sometimes knowing whether a counterpossible is true or false can be important, as in the second example. When evaluating competing logics, we need a way to assess claims like 2. More generally, when we wish to evaluate claims in domains in which all true claims are necessarily claims, like logic, mathematics, metaphysics, and perhaps basic normative claims, we will likely need a way to evaluate counterpossible claims. Alright, so the fact is, it's saying these could look like realistic statements depending if you changed some of like the antecedent or the consequent here. And so it would then make them look like they're substantive claims, and you wouldn't want them to be vacuously true as if by changing some random, some arbitrary piece of the sentence. So I guess the argument against vacuism then is it looks like an ad hoc result when you have relevant antecedents and consequence in your conditional, because you'd want to have a real answer at that point, not a arbitrary vacuous affirmative of the claim. Okay. An attractive alternative, suggested by Lewis himself, is to posit impossible worlds in addition to the familiar possible worlds. An impossible world account of counterpossibles makes a counterpossible if P then Q true if and only if the closest impossible P worlds are also Q worlds. I have one of my bugaboos at the moment is this closest claim right here. Oh, what did I just do? Oh, because I had already highlighted something. Sorry about that. Where am I? Here's what I'm worried about. This is what concerns me. The closest impossible world P. I don't know what close means in terms of... because I don't know what the distance between impossible worlds is. Alright, so let me just note that as a concern of mine. A good impossible world account of counterpossibles must explain what impossible worlds are and how the closeness relation operates on such worlds. Brogaard and Salerno's... henceforth B and S, not just BS, B and S remarks on counterpossibles seeks to provide these explanations. Since it is one of the only attempts to do so, and as such it is widely cited, I believe it deserves careful consideration. I will argue that their account is false as is. I will then discuss a potential amendment to their account and point out a few surprising and perhaps counterintuitive implications of the amended account. I conclude with some remarks on how BNS's insight may be incorporated in future attempts to analyze counterpossibles. Here's the plan for the remainder of the paper. In the next section, I present Brogaard and Salerno semantics for counterpossibles. The following two sections discuss in turn the two factors that compose their account. The first component is shown to have some unanticipated and potentially problematic consequences. The second component is shown to imply a counterintuitive result, which requires an amendment to the account. The amendment in turn is shown to itself have a surprising implication. I conclude in the final section. There's philosophers seem to like to do this. I mean, I don't blame them in terms of like the science-y, just lay out, explain everything. But and it's nothing on this author, of course. It's me and like all these papers where you tell people that you conclude in the final section. It's like, oh, thank you, you're so helpful. I need to know that. And again, there's nothing against this author. It's just the general philosophical strategy of signposting everything. It's just like, it's very good to signpost. Everyone out there really should do it. I don't do it enough myself, and I feel bad, and I get called out on it, and I'm just like, well, I'm sorry I didn't signpost enough. But like, I'm like, why are we signposting? Like, and then I conclude. It's like, that's awesome. Good for us. All right, and like I said, nothing against this author. This is just a standard philosophical writing practice right now. But you don't have to love that. Brogaard and Salerno's account. BNS preferred Lewisian account of subjunctive conditionals is the following. Lewisian account of some subjunctives. A subjunctive, if it were the case that P, it would be the case that Q, is true just when every closest P world is a Q world, where the closest is read as most relevantly similar. Yeah. Again, I have absolutely no idea what this is supposed to be any more than I understand closeness. So we'll find out what relevantly similar hopefully is. Lewis himself included only possible worlds in his theory. However, if this sort of Lewisian account is generally a good account for subjunctives, it is tempting to extend it to accommodate counterpossibles by adding impossible worlds to the theory. For example, it is tempting to think that 1. It is true because in the closest impossible world in which Hobbes succeeded in squaring the circle, sick children in the mountains of South America do not care. Why is that tempting at all? I have absolutely no idea why that'd be tempting, because I don't know what closest means. Again, not a problem with this author, this is a problem with the way I view these things. This is what's going on in my head. And it is tempting to think that, 2, it is false because in the closest impossible worlds in which intuitionistic logic is true, the law of exclude middle is not unrestrictedly valid. In order to make sense of this idea, we need an account of impossible worlds and the closeness relation between impossible worlds and the base world. An account of impossible worlds is supposed to be a natural extension of an account of possible worlds. Therefore, BNS are right to choose an account for worlds that can accommodate both possible and impossible worlds. According to their account, a world is a maximal set of sentences. Okay, that's fine. That's standard fare, which in turn they define as a maximal set. A set S is maximal if and only if for every sentence P, either P or not P or both is a member of S. So we can have both the you can assert both the P and the negation of it as a member in this set. Okay. Both possible and impossible worlds are maximal sets of sentences on the set. Yeah, because impossible might have both in there, I guess. Possible worlds tend to not. But we'll see what how this author slices it up. With only the following differences between the two. Possible worlds are deductively closed, meaning that for any sentence contained in the world contains all of its logical consequences as well. In contrast, impossible worlds need not be deductively closed. As is standard, what it means for a sentence to be true in a world is for the sentence to be a member of the set of sentences that compose the given world. Of course, if you got both of them in it, then they're both true. So then you're going to be power consistent. Yeah, you're going to need some sort of power consistent logic, though. Because, I mean, if they have that or both membership claim above. Since the definition of worlds is rather unrestrictive, that is, any maximal set of sentences counts as a world no matter how incoherent, the onus remains on the closeness relation to predict which counterpossibles are true and which are false. It is therefore this part of their theory that I will focus on. What determines the closeness of impossible worlds? BNS's proposal involves 2 factors. They formulate a formal count of closeness as an account for comparing of worlds to the base world as follows. Closeness. For any 2 impossible worlds, W1, W2, W1 is closer to the base world than W2 if and only if less inconsistent. W1 does not contain a greater number of sentences formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts, true of the base world held fixed in the context than W2 does. And if 1 and 2 contain the same number of sentences formally inconsistent with relevant background facts held fixed in the context, more implications, W1 preserves a greater number of a priori implications between sentences than W2 does. Okay, so this is, we've got a consistency condition and a greater number of a priori implications. I don't know, I mean, this is okay, so you're having more and more, it's a definition on consistency for closeness. Okay, we'll see how that, shakes out. I don't really understand why anyone thinks that's close. I mean, you're just like, I understand why people think that would work. I mean, I'm still grumpy about this, but that's, again, me. BNS's account closeness of impossible worlds is determined by the 2 factors that I have dubbed less inconsistent and more implications. The first factor tells us the closest worlds are those in which, as much as possible, is similar to relevant facts in the base world. This is the issue. I don't know what relevant is then, because you can have arbitrary things being wrong, but like they could be like everything is consistent except they like misspell like relevant. You put like an E over here or something, and then all of a sudden it would be a little different. Is that relevant? Probably not, but again, it seems like you have to choose which facts are already important to know which ones where the consistency applies and where it doesn't, and then you get into the weeds. This is part of my concern about this, is that everyone's cherry picking what counts as inconsistency and relevant in these situations, and that's just what they mean by close, is what they want it to mean. But yeah, that's what my concern is in the background. Alright, anywho, this can potentially explain why the closest Hobbes squared the circle worlds are those in which sick children in South America at the time care nothing about whether Hobbes succeeded in solving some mathematical puzzle that they do not understand, and that will have no effect on their lives. Therefore, one is true. The second factor tells us that the closer worlds are those in which more a priori implications are preserved. In the second example, the thought is that it is an a priori implication of intuitionist logic that the law of the excluded middle does not hold. After all, the exclusion of the law of the excluded middle is just part of what we mean by intuitionist logic, so there is a conceptual a priori implication. This is supposed to explain why the closer intuitionist logic worlds are those in which it is not the case that the law of excluded middle holds, and 2 is false. Okay. So the first one is just sort of the relevance, and the second one is more the a priori. So the first one is less inconsistent, I guess. Second, yeah, the a priori implications. Okay, it's mostly the a priori implications. Before analyzing the view in greater detail, let me make 2 initial observations. First, BNS's account lacks a uniformity that an account of closeness can be expected to have. BNS restrict their account of closeness to impossible worlds, whereas we should expect a general and hopefully unified account of closeness for both possible and impossible worlds. After all, in addition to comparing impossible worlds with each other, we need our theory to tell us how impossible worlds stand in relation to possible worlds. In fact, surprising as it may seem, at first several authors have argued that sometimes impossible worlds can be closer than possible worlds. Yeah, because you can have something that's you can mess up. I don't know what these authors would say, but you can play around with your logic to make something really, really, really close to a possible world, but then have one thing that's just not true in it. And so that would give you a contradiction or something and be an impossible world, but it's like impossibly close to the other one. So I can see why someone would think that. Second, their method of measuring differences and measuring degrees of a priori implications is by counting sentences. Yeah, this is part of like the why do some contradictions matter and not others. I mean, you're just counting up sentences. Van der Laan has already warned against this sort of method. One of the features of this method is that it gives equal weight to all relevant differences. Yeah, that's what I was talking about, that E switched to an A. Why is that relevant? Irrelevant. An A switched to an A. In this respect, their account seems to go against Lewis' insight that weights of different standards of comparison can differ depending on context. Surprisingly, we will soon learn that their account actually implies that we never need to count, and this is contrary to how BNS themselves present it. Now let's move to a detailed analysis of BNS's account of closeness. Minimizing discrepancies with the base world. In this section, I will discuss a number of implications of the first factor in BNS's account, less inconsistent. A pertinent difficulty in assessing their account is that they do not provide an account for relevant background facts. This makes their account flexible enough to ad hocly give the right predictions to many potential counterexamples. It is just alright. This right here, this is it's sort of, there's a criticism of BNS, but they're not. This is just sort of a claim here. They're not arguing for it. They're just saying it's flexible because they didn't actually do it. They didn't actually give enough of an account, so it's just ad hoc. Alright, so let's see what they actually argue for. Therefore, in this section, I will not be able to provide a conclusive counter example to their theory. However, I will show that in adjusting the set of relevant background facts so that their theory makes the desired predictions, a number of bullets are bitten. Okay, so they have to show that it's... So what's going to happen here is they're showing that because they don't provide an account of relevant background facts, which makes them flexible, they show that you need to have more relevant background facts, and or else you're going to have to suffer biting lots of bullets. Or either way, you're going to have to bite the bullets. First, I will prove that their account has the following implication. L1. For any counter possible of the form if P then Q, and any formally consistent base world such as the actual world, it'd be would P then would Q, I guess you'd say. All the nearest P worlds must be such that at most P is the only sentence formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts. Okay, so it's going to be restricted to what they claim. Okay. The proof is as follows. For any P in any base world, there is a world identical to the base world except that includes P as well. Okay, so it's this world plus P. Call this world the constructed world. If the base world is formally consistent, then the only sentence in the constructed world that can potentially be formally inconsistent with the background facts, that is a subset of the base world, is P itself. No P world can have less sentences formally inconsistent with the relevant facts than that. Therefore, because of less inconsistent, all the nearest P worlds are such that at most P is only sentence formally consistent with the background facts. Recall that according to BNS's theory, maximizing a priori implications only comes in after we found the worlds with the least inconsistencies with the relevant background facts. Okay. From L1, we can derive a further implication of their account. For any counterpossible, the form would P then Q, and any formally consistent base world, if Q, or any other sentence that formally implies Q, is a relevant background fact in the context, then would P then Q is true. The proof is as follows. We already know that L1, that if the base world is consistent, then all the nearest P worlds cannot contain any sentence inconsistent with a relevant background fact other than P. Therefore, if Q or any other sentence that formally implies Q is among the relevant background facts, then the nearest P worlds cannot contain any sentence formally inconsistent with Q, including not Q. Since the worlds are maximal, this implies in turn that all the nearest P worlds in such contexts must include Q. Therefore, in such a context, would P then Q must be true. Because Q is part of the base world already, it must be true and consistent, so any sort of conditional of this form will be vacuously true, because not vacuously, but since the consequence is true, the conditional is true. L2 creates trouble for two of BNS's own examples assessed by their own stated intuitions about these examples. Here are the examples. 3. If water had not been H2O, if water had not been H2O, it would not have been XYZ. 4. If power consistent logic were correct, then the principle of explosion would still be valid. Of course, the principle of explosion, where logic goes boom. BNS have the intuition that 3 and 4 are false, and this seems correct. However, whether or not the account gives this prediction will depend on which are the relevant background facts. BNS seem to believe that water is not XYZ is a relevant background fact in 3, and the principle of explosion is valid and is relevant in 4. However, based on L2, we know that if water is not XYZ is a relevant fact to 3, then BNS's theory implies that 3 is true, contrary to their intuitions. Similarly, if the principle of explosion is valid is a relevant fact to 4, then their theory implies that 4 is true, contrary to their intuition. We can only get the intuitive result if we assume the aforementioned sentences and anything that formally implies them are not among the relevant background facts. This is one bullet they'll have to bite. Yeah. So in the minimal case, then the fact that Q is not equal to P, I guess you need to assume that P and Q are not identical. Because, I mean, would P, then would P would just be okay. But, if the not identity of Q and P, then Q is going to fall into the base world, and therefore, have to be true. According to if it's the actual world, it is true. And then so that causes a problem, because if you have the intuition that there's hypotheticals like this, then you're going to have the false hypotheticals. Then you can't make those false based on your own, the base logic that you're basing inconsistency on. So you'd have to get rid of the inconsistency, I guess, or how you're understanding inconsistency here. So in some sense, this is interesting, because this is showing how inconsistency plays into the inconsistency, and the logic of implication plays into this story here. Okay, so that's an interesting feature of what's going on. Okay. Yeah, and that has to do with relevancy of the background facts. So, that's, yeah. Okay, from L1 we can derive another implication. L3, for any counterpossible with P then Q, in any formally consistent base world, if not P or any sense that informally implies not P is among the relevant background facts, then all the nearest P worlds will contain an infinite number of senses formally inconsistent with P, such as, well, a long string of negations, as long as it's an odd string, and so on. I guess you have to have some rules about negation cancellation, but that should be okay in this area. Here's the proof. If P or any sense that formally implies, if not P, or if any sense that formally implies not P is among the relevant background facts, then P is inconsistent with a relevant background fact. Yeah. So if you have P and not P, then you've got some inconsistency. Do you have power consistent logic? But probably not here. It follows from L1 that in all the nearest P worlds, P must be the only sense inconsistent with relevant background facts. Because here's where the inconsistency comes in, because they're using the closeness also based on inconsistency. Therefore, none of the nearest P worlds include any other sense formally inconsistent with not P. Hence, they cannot include all the strings of things that are inconsistent with not P. So you could say all the even numbered negations in front of the variable, the predicate sentence, and any other sentence which consists in an even number of negations to P. I wasn't reading that, I was just saying it. Since worlds are maximal, all the nearest worlds must therefore include the negations of these, for example, the odd numbers of negations, and so on. If ever not P or any sentence that informally implies not P is among the relevant background facts, we get an extremely counterintuitive result. An example will help demonstrate the problem. Consider the following counterpossible. If power-consistent logic were correct, then power-consistent logic would not be correct. Yeah. The sentence is odd, as most counterpossibles tend to be. Nevertheless, if we are favorable to non-vacuism, it would seem that we should think that 5 is false. However, if power-consistent logic is not correct, is a relevant background fact, then BNS's account predicts counterintuitively that 5 is true. So in order to avoid such counterpossibles, B and S will have to bite another bullet, namely that not P or any sentence that formally implies not P can never be among the relevant background facts. And this is contrary to what they sometimes suppose. Alright, so I don't know, there's a footnote here and you'd have to look it up that they actually do suppose this. But yeah, this is a funny thing where you're having like strings of negations and you're assuming that doesn't ever happen. Yeah. You may think this is a bullet that makes sense to bite. After all, in counterfactual context, we are interested in what things would be like if the antecedent P were true, setting aside the fact that in the actual world the antecedent is false. However, if we accept this restriction on the set of relevant background facts, we get a surprising result. The surprising result derives from the following implication of BNS's theory. L4. For any counterpossible, would P then Q? Subjunctive P then Q. Any formally consistent base world, if no sentence that formally implies not P is among the relevant background facts, then all the nearest P worlds include no sentence that is formally inconsistent with any of the relevant background facts. Okay, proof of L4 is simple. L1 says that in all the nearest P worlds, P can be the only sentence formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts. If the set of relevant background facts includes no sentence formally inconsistent with P, then P itself is formally consistent with the relevant background facts. So you can throw P in. Hence, there can be no sentence in the nearest P world that is formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts. L4, in conjunction with the claim from above that not P or anything that formally implies not P are never among the relevant background facts, implies there can never be among the nearest P worlds any world that includes any sentence that is formally inconsistent with any background relevant fact. Is there a problem with this result other than the fact that BNS probably did not have it in mind? Without an account of relevant background facts, this result is not in itself enough to construct a conclusive counterexample. However, it does have the following two consequences. Less inconsistent is misleading as it is formulated, because what's the closeness now? We need not count count inconsistency with relevant background facts because the account is intolerant to any inconsistencies with these facts here, because you can't use a consistency all of a sudden. In addition, once we know that this is what less inconsistent implies, we realize how much of the burden of their account falls on defining the relevant set of background facts for which they do not account for, and maximizing a priori implications for which we now turn. Hey, I like actually having my a priori opinions vindicated. It's always so nice when someone else, like I'm always complaining about the relevancy of closeness and what does that actually mean, and it's very rare. It is so rare to actually find like proof and like, oh, I said this earlier, and then they actually agree with me. I'm like, yay, author. Hooray. Okay, so this author gets a +1. Yeah, some days I'm grumpy and a curmudgeon. Today I'm like, nah, I don't care. It's like, awesome. Maximizing a priori implications. Let us now examine the second part of the account, namely more implications. To get a feeling of what B and S mean by a priori implications, consider the following two sentences. 2. If intuition logic were the correct logic, then the law of exclude middle would still be unrestrictedly valid. And 6. If water had not been H2O, it would have been H2O. So if water had not been H2O, it would have been, and if it were the correct logic, then the law of exclude middle would still be unrestrictedly valid. Their thought is that 2 and 6 are false because there is a sense in which water is not H2O implies, and in some salient sense of implies that it is not the case that water is H2O, and intuitionist logic. It says intuitionist. I'm still thinking power consistent. I'm sorry. I'm getting my intuitions and power consistency all messed up here. And intuitionist logic is correct implies, in some salient sense of implies, that it is not the case that the law of exclude middle holds. Of course, it does not hold in intuitionist logic. What kind of implication is this? Whether you understand logical implication as a matter of necessity, meaning that in any possible world in which the antecedent is true, the consequent is true as well, or as a matter of logical form, meaning that the antecedent implies the consequent in virtue of logical form alone, the implication here is not logical implication. It isn't the former because the antecedent is false in all possible worlds, and it isn't the latter because in at least 2, the logical relation between the antecedent and the consequent does not hold in virtue of the logical form. BNS's thought is that, despite the lack of logical implication, in both cases there is something we know a priori to follow from the antecedent. It's like, well, if you've got an impossible world, you could still get things out of it, especially using power-consistent logic. So, there might be some sort of relevant logic also that might be able to do something here. Because people make other logics to handle these sorts of problems. Okay. We may not know a priori that water is H2O, even if it is metaphysically necessary, but we know a priori that if it is not H2O, then it is not H2O. Similarly, we know a priori that if intuitionistic logic is true, then the law of exclude middle is not unrestrictedly valid. Well, it's part of the definition. BNS formulate a priori implications as follows. A priori implication. For a speaker S in a context C, P a priori implies Q if and only for S in C, Q is a relevant a priori consequence of P. So we got more relevancy right here. Even though they are not explicit, it is more charitable to their view to suppose that P does not necessarily represent a single sense, but rather a set of senses. Yeah, that's fine. They do not say much more about what a priori implications are, but they take it as a basic notion that we should just grasp by examples of the sort mentioned above. They emphasize that what a proposition implies a priori can be context dependent. The intuitionist logic example may demonstrate why this is so. There may be contexts in which it is a priori that intuitionist logic or some other logic is false, and then it may not be clear what it implies a priori. Everything, nothing, something. However, there can be other contexts in which intuitionist logic is not a priori false, and in such contexts it a priori implies that the law of excluded middle is false. Alright, so then we're going to context, which is perhaps just as unclear as relevant in my world, because we don't know what is relevant and we don't know which contexts are important all of a sudden. Okay, While it is attractive to think that a priori implications are relevant for the assessment of counterpossibles and the closeness of worlds, BNS's formalization yields unintuitive results. For instance, their account implies that the following counterpossible is true. If water had not been H2O, then it might have been H2O. I'll explain. BNS's theory has the following implication. Alright, for any world 1 and any world 2, W1, W2, that is the union of world 1 with any set of senses that are members of the base world is at least as close as W1 in any context. Okay, so you're throwing any true sentence in the base world with W1. And W2 is the union of 1 with some other thing. Okay. The proof is simple. Adding W2 senses from the base world cannot add formal inconsistency with the relevant background facts in the base world. Therefore, as far as less implications is concerned, any such pair of worlds would be tied regardless of the context, which determines the set of relevant background facts. Next, as far as more implications is concerned, W2 cannot include any less a priori implications in comparison to W1. The reason is that a priori implication is a relation between sentences. Any sentence W1 is in W2 as well. Therefore, any a priori implication is in W1 is included in W2. From L5, we can derive the further result that among the closest water is not H2O worlds, there must be a world that includes water is H2O. Here is the proof. Suppose there's a world W3 that is among the closest water is not H2O worlds. Then there exists a world, call it W4, that is the union of W3 with water is H2O. L5 implies that W4 is at least as close to W3. Since W3 is among the closest world, and so is W4, this includes water is H2O. Therefore, BNS's account counterintuitively implies 7 is true. 7 being that, yeah. So if water had not been this, then it might have been this, because you can always seem to throw in true sentences from the base world, even to any sort of subjunctive here. If water had not been this, then you can also throw this in. And so, yeah, again, with the closeness problem, because this is always going to be close because it's always going to be part of the base world anyway, even though the antecedent is not. Okay, so more death by relevant closeness. There is no getting around this result without revising the account. One salient possibility is to revise more implications in the following manner. We want an account that implies the less coherent world is, the farther away it is. The way we measure coherence, if we remain in line with B and S's thinking, will have to do with a priori implications. Therefore, what we can say is that the more a world contains sentences formally inconsistent with the a priori implications of other sentences, the farther they are. In the above example, W4 might now come out farther than W3 because W4 contains the additional sentence water is H2O, which is formally inconsistent with water is not H2O. Let us then see what happens if we replace more implications as follows. Closeness star. For any two impossible worlds, W1 and W2, W1 is closer to the base world than W2, if and only less inconsistent. W1 does not contain a greater number of sentences formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts. True of the base world, held fixed in the context than W2 does, and if 1 and 2 contain the same number of sentences formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts, held fixed in the context, less disimplications. W1 includes less sentences formally inconsistent with the a priori implications than the sentences than W2 does. Okay. So, disimplications, not implications. Okay, let them explain. As I will now explain, this suggestion leads to another surprising result. To derive the result, I will need a further assumption that is extremely intuitive. Every sentence a priori implies itself. I mean, depends who you are, how extreme that is, but it seems reasonable on most accounts. It is difficult to imagine a context in which some sentence P doesn't a priori imply P. There is definitely logics where you don't get that though. The following is a consequence of L6. L7. Any world that contains one sentence formally inconsistent with an a priori implication of another sentence in the world contains infinite sentences formally inconsistent with a priori implications of other sentences within the world. Was it just explosion here? Any world that contains one sentence formally inconsistent with a priori implication. Yeah, it just seems like you've got explosion on this one. Okay, for some world W contains one sentence formally inconsistent with an a priori implication of another sentence in that world, henceforth a disimplication. For instance, suppose P implies not Q, and W includes P and Q, or any other sentence formally inconsistent with not Q. The world also contains Q or some other sentence formally inconsistent with not Q, which a priori implies itself. Any sentence which consists of some number of negations of Q must be formally inconsistent with either not Q, or with any sentence formally inconsistent with not Q. Since worlds are maximal, such a world must contain infinitely many disimplications. Yeah. So you get so if you get this, so you get explosion, and so okay, but you need the implies itself, I guess. L7 implies that there are only two kinds of worlds: worlds with zero disimplications and worlds with infinite disimplications. There exists nothing in between the two extremes. From the previous section, we know that for any sentence P, all the nearest P worlds include all of the relevant background facts and any sentence formally implied by them. Now, either there is a world that contains all of these and has zero disimplications, or there is no such world. Let's consider what must be the case in each possibility. If there is no such world, then less disimplications falls out of the picture because all worlds with the least inconsistencies with background facts have an equal number of disimplications, namely infinity. In turn, this implies that every single world that is formally consistent with the relevant background facts includes P is among the nearest P worlds. With all this, what all this implies is that the revised account, closeness star, is equivalent to the following. A counterpossible would P then Q is true if and only if one of the following attains. Q is identical to P. I think I mentioned this up on top a little bit earlier. B, the relevant background facts formally imply Q. C, there are worlds that contain P and all the relevant background facts, and no a priori disimplications between a sentence, and all such worlds contain Q. Now let's focus on C. Let S represent the set of sentences that is the union of P and all of the relevant background facts. Let WS represent the set of all worlds that include S as a subset, and that in addition have no a priori disimplications. What must be the case in order for all of the members of WS to include Q, except for possibilities A and B? It must be the case that not Q is a disimplication of some other sentences in all members of WS. That and only that would force all worlds in WS not to include not Q, and that would therefore to include Q because they are maximal. This suggests, though lacking a test for a priori implication, I can't prove it, that C obtains only if S a priori implies Q, or some proposition that formally entails Q. If this is correct, then we get the following. A counterpossible would P then Q is true if and only if one of the following obtains. Q is identical to P. The relevant background facts formally imply Q. And C star. The union of P and the relevant background facts and all sentences formally implied by the relevant background facts a priori imply Q, or a proposition that formally entails Q, and there is a world that contains all of these sentences and includes no a priori disimplications. Yeah. Okay. So you have to get Q. Where does this leave us? And we're almost done too. Page 18 of 21. Brogaard and Salerno's account yields an implausible result. We considered an amendment which replaces more implications with less disimplications. The amended account was shown to entail a surprising result, namely that all the closest P worlds contain all the relevant background facts into any sentence formally implied by them, and that a priori implications can only play a role if such worlds can be constructed with absolutely no a priori disimplications. Well, okay, so they don't explode. Among other things, this means that, contrary to initial appearances, we never have to count sentences. The closest worlds cannot contain any sentences formally inconsistent with the relevant background facts, nor can they contain a finite non-zero number of disimplications. Yeah, because you get the maximality, you get too many sentences. So it separates everything out. As it stands, the account is so flexible that it is difficult to falsify. So long as we lack a method for discerning what the relevant set of background facts is and what the a priori implications are, relevant a priori implications are in a given context, it is in principle difficult to construct a counter example to the amended account. Suppose you have a counterpossible of the form would P then Q. Suppose the desired prediction is that this counterpossible come out true. If Q is also true of the base world, then we can just posit that Q is as a relevant background fact, and the account will give the desired prediction. If Q is not true of the base world, then we can just say that it is a priori implied by P, or perhaps by the conjunction of P and some set of sentences that are true of the base world. Then we can posit those sentences from the base world are among the set of relevant background facts. Similar moves can be made if the desired result is that would P then Q is false. There's nothing in the theory to block such ad hoc maneuvers. To illustrate, here's how the amended account can handle the two opening examples. If Hobbes had squared the circle, sick children in the mountains of South America at the time would not have cared is intuitively true. In order for this to fit their account, the most natural explanation is that the consequent sick children in the mountains of South America at the time do not care is a relevant background fact in the context. And that's why all the nearest Hobbes squared the circle worlds must contain the consequent. If intuition is logic, or the correct logic, then the law of exclude middle would still be unrestrictedly valid as false, because in the context the law of exclude middle is unrestrictedly valid is formally inconsistent with an a priori implication of the antecedent. Intuitionist logic is the correct logic. Furthermore, there exists intuitionist logic is the correct logic world such that none of its components formally contradict any relevant background facts, nor does it consist of any a priori disimplications, and all such worlds do not include the law of exclude middle is unrestrictedly valid. Yeah, so you can just build your universe to make these things come out is the author's point. It's just the theory of BNS the author's arguing then is just too it doesn't make a strong enough distinction to be useful, because everything can be made to work. Okay. Quite generally, my view is that unfalsifiability is a reason to be less impressed by a lack of counterexamples, but it is not a reason to believe that the account is false. This flexibility does imply, however, that the amended account cannot make any substantial predictions. There's no distinctions here, so there's no predictions. Yeah, it cannot make any substantial predictions. This is one reason to hope for a better non-vacuous account of counterpossibles. Such an account may still incorporate some of BNS's insights. That's very diplomatic of you, author. BNS call their account an epistemic account because their main insight is that the semantics of counterpossibles are partially determined by a priori implications. This is interesting that the epistemic features, rather than the metaphysical features, should determine the closeness relation between worlds. Perhaps this is not by chance. One of the reasons we need non-trivial counterpossibles is to allow us to evaluate propositions that are necessary if true and impossible if false. For instance, when trying to figure out which is the correct logic, we want to know the implication of suggested logics. At least as far as this sort of need for counterpossibles is concerned, it is an epistemic need. If a certain kind of reasoning is invoked for epistemic needs, it is no surprise that epistemic factors determine the behavior of the linguist tools we use to conduct such reasoning. My guess is that further digging into the epistemic function of counterpossibles will advance our understanding of the semantics of counterpossibles. Okay, so that was a good paper. Basically arguing that there were too many undefined terms or under-specified terms built into the beginning of this theory that BNS have put forward, and given that there are too few of them, that they're underspecified, you can prove too many things, or you can prove it's kind of arbitrary that you always get the right sort of result that you want. And so if you can't make any predictions, you don't get any, if you can't make any strong, you're not making any strong distinctions, you're not really saying much. Now, very diplomatic at the end to say what was important about the account, but that wasn't the main thrust of the article. Yeah. So this was good old technical philosophy, and it was pretty good, pretty well executed, so I thought it was good. Yeah, got the blinded version here, so I don't have a whole lot more to say. I just liked that some of my initial ramblings were a little bit vindicated. It's always so much such a rare thing. So let me, any of the viewers have any questions, you let me know. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, for tomorrow morning for more review. And, I could have zoomed in a little bit more, couldn't I? I apologize for that. Yeah, it could have been right there. Shucks. Okay, forgot. Anywho, that's it for now. I hope everyone has a good night and stays safe out there. It's still kind of dangerous, even though America decides they're going to open without testing anyone. It's sort of amazing. It really is. Yeah, I think New York is still under lockdown for a bit, so I'll be back. Have a good night, stay safe, and I'll be back tomorrow.